Hi, everyone. Ashley Mailloux and Gino Buccola here. We're going to take a look at Golden Gate Fields this Saturday. One of their signature races is the Grade 3 San Francisco Mile. No shocker here, Gino. Mile on the turf course, a nice $175,000 purse. And I think the bigger thing to talk about, 13 horses entered, 12 in the main body. And it's kind of an interesting move. Horses coming off the synthetic or the turf, whether that be at Golden Gate or Santa Anita.
Yeah, you have a strong field here. Some nice Southern California barns sent runners up. D'Amato, Powell, Callahan, Gaines, Mandela, Glatt all have runners entered in this race. And it will be very challenging because you're going to have a big field and some classy horses. You have last year's winner of this race, who's not really been in the best of form as of late. Balnikov, who won this thing last year, is 0 for 7 since. So while he comes into this race probably feeling confident, getting back to a place he last won, just not coming into the race in the greatest of form.
No, but we'll see what he can do against this group. Obviously, the purse attracted these trainers to come down here, or I should say come up from Southern California. And we'll take a look at the time form US pace projections here, which I think is where things get a little interesting. On paper, Air Force Red, he likes to be forward. Does he necessarily find the lead every time? No, but at a mile distance, I think it's more likely that he finds the lead. He tried to do that in the Grade 3 American. He was just fourth best. All in all, I think he ran well. He has to face Sumter once again in this spot, but it also seems like the horse to his outside, Astronomer, off the layoff, he could be forward. He's been forward in a couple of races, including the Breeders' Cup Mile, and prior to that in a Grade 2 event.
Those three horses that you just kind of quickly mentioned are so fascinating for this race because Air Force Red, probably the quickest of them if they really want to go. I thought he ran a bang up race holding on for fourth last time out. The horse outside of him, Astronomer, he's pretty quick, but the problem is he hasn't run since November. So we're a little concerned if we're going to get the best from him, or maybe he's a little short. You also have Sumter, who, while he's shown that he can come off the pace more recently, he's actually never won that way. His only wins have really been going long when he's been right on the lead. So tactically, I thought this was a fascinating race in a big field like this because you know what, Ashley, with 13 horses, not everybody is going to get the trip that they want in here. Some of these horses are going to get shuffled back. There's going to be some trouble. So very, very curious to see how this all plays out. And Timeform US has Air Force Red leading the way.
And leading off the field here is the number 1, Il Bellator, who was fifth last time out. Now, that was on the synthetic. It was in the Golden Gate Handicap. Prior to that, he tried a graded stakes event at Santa Anita, and honestly, he's been pretty well traveled in his last 4 starts. The big thing for him against this field, he's getting blinkers on. My concern would be he hasn't been to the winner's circle in quite some time. You have to go back to just about 2 years ago to find that win, and it hasn't been on the turf. He's 0 for 5 on the turf at this point in his career.
Yeah, he's a stakes winner. He was third in this race last year at 56-1. But the problem is, as you pointed out, he has not won since April of 2022. So that's 8 races back. He hasn't even raced in 5.5 months. He just feels like he's in a little tough here for me.
Now, the 2 here, I'd love to own a horse like this. He's a hard-knocking type who will take a look at his most recent performance and ended up with a trip to the winner's circle back on April 5th. Now, I know it's on the synthetic. It's not on the turf, but the fractions were pretty swift early on. The half came up in a solid 46-3, and he was able to close from off of it. But he's going to draw clear here very nicely. He didn't go off favored, but to me, it's the eye-catching 96 buyer that makes you start wondering, was that kind of a fluke for him? Go down the page. It's really not a fluke for him. This is a horse that consistently fires big numbers.
I completely agree. It sounds like we were similar with him when we were handicapping this race. Like initially I was looking at him thinking a little more like, he's really a synthetic horse. You start to dive in. His grass races are not that far off from his synthetic races. And honestly, Ashley, I just think he's a better horse now than he was when he was racing on the turf more regularly. He just seems like he's in fantastic form right now. The horse to his outside is one of his rivals. I'm going to be somebody. They've actually faced each other 6 times since September, and he's gotten the better. Lamas has 5 of those 6 times, and he really feels like he could get a great trip in here. As I was going back and back through this race, I was trying to find a couple horses that would sit mid-pack and be able to get the jump on some of the deeper closers. And the horse who I just kept coming back to with that trip was him. Like he really just feels like he could get a great trip in here, save some ground down towards the inside, not have to be way, way out of it. He knows this track very, very well. I have a hard time leaving him out of exotics. I really started to warm up to him more and more the more I looked at this race.
I agree. I think he's going to get the right trip. And you talked about his turf races, and in one of them, Silent Poet beat him, who I know it wasn't a stakes race that was against, but Silent Poet, graded stakes winner. You just look at him, and you've mentioned the point about I'm going to be somebody, Freeport Joe. These horses have, squared off against each other several times would be an understatement, and he's typically on the better side of it. So I think he's an intriguing horse in this spot. We talked about I'm going to be somebody. He's next here up in the field. He's post 3. They've given him some tries at graded stakes competition. He hasn't fared well. But with that said, his running style to me has changed a little bit in recent times. They look like they're trying to get him to rate a little bit more than he did, say, 4 or 5 starts ago.
Yeah, I just have a hard time getting a feel for him in this spot, exactly what they want to do. You were pointing at what kind of trip are they looking for? And so he's going to have to deal with the rival to his inside first and foremost, and then a bunch of other really, really tough horses, all on a surface that it may not be his favorite. So for me, in this wide open, really challenging race, I just liked others a little bit more.
Before Belnikov, you alluded to it earlier last year. He won this race, and that was the last time that he's found the winner's circle. Obviously, he's been in some very, very deep races. You see the winners of some of them. Goliad, who's a freak when he's on the lead. There's Easter and Lane Way, De Jour, Golden Phoenix. I mean, he's had so many nice performances since then, but they've been hit or miss. I thought last time out, it wasn't a great one. 3 starts back, though, I thought he ran very well at a mile and a 16th, but I have some confusion with him in the sense that his numbers have taken a little bit of a decline. He's had a little bit of a break again. And the other thing is, to me, when you look at this, Gino, you just keep on trying different distances and they're flip-flopping it all the time on him. And I just don't know if they're trying to find the right spot for him or they're just trying to get him back in the winner's circle. It's a little bit confusing.
I agree with you. To me, he's like at the bottom of the exotics just because you sort of know what you're going to get from him a late rally. And in this race, that might be enough to pass a lot of horses in here. There are versions of this race where Air Force Red is going and probably
Right.
Clovis Connection's going and Sumter's not too far and Astronomer's not too far. And in that version of this race, he gets a great, great setup. The problem is, as you were hitting at, it just his running style leaves him so much to do. He's
Right.
so much at the mercy of racing luck to where he can get himself into traffic or slower paces or just caught behind other horses or have to go wide. And so many different things can happen for me to just, it would really have to be a race where there were so many horses that were all like one dimensional for me to want to get to him right now. Much more of an underneath type.
And he might take a lot of playing here just on
Yeah.
the connections in the class. So I think in a field like this, when it's deep, it's okay to go price shopping elsewhere. Now, the 5 Captain Peak up next. Unlike several in here, he's coming here fresh off a win. We'll take a look at that win last time out where he was dead last at one point in this race. He had a lot of work to do, and I thought it was a well-timed ride. Now, big thing, though, was at a mile and an eighth. He's going to cut back to a mile. The mile seemed to be just a little bit short for him. 2 starts back, but Kings River Knight, he's an admirable foe. So, to finish second to him, I think is respectable. And I'm curious about this horse. Unlike Belnikov, they decided to make the move to just drop him into lower races that he was eligible for, and he met the condition. And to me, maybe those last 2, it's given him a little bit of a confidence boost. I think coming in here off a win is certainly not a bad thing.
He's remarkably consistent too. If you're just looking at buyer speed figures, he has 9 straight turf races between a 92 and a 95. So when you're a gambler or a handicapper, you really like that because you know what you're going to get from this horse from a consistency standpoint. He's a stakes winner. He's multiple graded stakes place. So it's not even class that concerns me with him. He's another one where it's mainly running style, right? He will probably have to pass 10 horses in this race. Out of the 13, he just will set himself up towards the back of the pack. He'll need things to develop up front, and it probably will, but he will have to maneuver through traffic. And I don't really have a problem with him, but with his particular running style, I did use others that I think are going to be a little bit more tactical in here. So while he fits at the level, he's just another that without that early speed and the fact that he's going to have to try to turn the tables on Astronomer, I'm a Gambler, some horses who have finished in front of him. And I don't even know if those are his 2 biggest concerns in this race.
We'll move on to the 6 Air Force Red, who will probably not have to weave through traffic like other horses such as Captain Peak. And we'll actually take a look at his most recent performance. It was in the Grade 3 American. And, he's the pace setter in here. And I understand he's going to weekend. He's going to kind of back in out of this. We also highlighted Sumter here, who ends up finishing just in front of him by a length and a half. But I think the bigger story here is Who did he face? It's a grade 3, but I'm going to go on a limb here, and maybe not a big limb by any means. I think a lot of people agree the winner here is the real deal. A super nice horse who was ready to roll, did get a perfect trip off the pace. But I think when you look at Air Force Red, he ran well last time. It was a credible race. And from a pace perspective, he at least should be somewhere early and probably late as well.
Yeah, and they were flying early on in that race. Ashley, you dive into it. I mean, they went 21-3. They went sub 45 fractions going a mile. And what was really impressive to me, Air Force Red actually held on really well. So just to give you an idea of how that race shaped up, there was a horse named Genius Jimmy who was putting pressure on Air Force Red early on in that race.
Right.
Genius Jimmy finished dead last in that
Right.
field of 10, and Air Force Red was fourth, and almost and Sumter passed him late, but he was holding pretty well that day. That was just his second start back off the long layoff. And I think with him, they would sit a little bit last year in some races going shorter. You were hinting at this perfectly. Down the hill, I think he can sit off a little bit, but going a mile, I just don't think that's the trip they want for him to try to sit and then have to have another gear. Let's just get him out front. Let's try to run him away, like run him off their feet. Let's really try to get some separation in here. Third start off the long layoff. I hope that's the game plan for him, because you look into his form last year, he was getting really, really good. And if everybody were to show up with their A game or get their ideal pace, shape, or scenario, he might have the best race of anyone in this field if he were to get that lone speed trip and be able to air them out here. I just was really impressed with him last year. I think he's rounding back into form nicely. Third start off the long layoff. So I hope he's winging it early on the front end, Ashley.
The 7 Astronomer up next. He's making his first start since late November of 2023. And Gino, he's had a layoff before. It was a longer layoff, to say the least, but he needed a race to get back into form. And after that, he had 2 very nice races, got himself a spot in the Breeders' Cup Mile, and then came back. They gave him one shot at Del Mar in the late fall. We haven't seen him since. I didn't know what to do with him. I just felt like from a fitness edge, other horses are going to have the jump on him, but he's shown glimpses of talent in the past.
Yeah, completely agree. Kind of mixed feelings with him, because you look at his form and then you go race by race, and kind of quickly you're like, this all makes sense. I mean, you can just toss his debut. He faced a nice horse. He tried the dirt in his second start. Then once he got back to the grass, he wins 2 in a row. He's off a very long layoff. So once he comes back off that long layoff of 20 months, he has to need the race. He doesn't really fire then. Then he comes back and he runs big in back-to-back races, and they throw him in the Breeders' Cup. So, and you can just say the Breeders' Cup was too tough. And then in his last race, it was a race he probably needed. It was a race we could probably excuse, because following that, he's off for 5 months. You do a little archaeology with the past performances, right? You do a little digging, and you can find that he doesn't have a bunch of bad races or a bunch of races that you look at and go, what happened there? That doesn't make sense. But my counter to myself would be what you said. Is he fit enough for a spot like this where he'll probably be chasing some pretty quick fractions? So while I'm kind of hemming and hawing, he's more of an underneath horse for me.
Next up in the field's Coalinga Road. This one out of the Carla Gaines bar. Now has one start off that lengthy layoff. Finished 5th in the Sensational Star, but did face Calbreds in that spot. Was a 6.5 furlong effort, which I think when you look into it, you probably think, this was setting him up for something else, right? And stretching him out in distance. And I know you go down the page, he's fared well in sprints, but you're going back to 2020 and more recent times, he's really been a 2-turn horse. So to me, I can't dive too deep into it. He made up a little bit of ground in the race and maybe had a fair bit of trouble, but this is going to be different. He draws against a big field in here. He's going to make an improvement. Second start off the layoff and stretch out. Certainly he could take a step forward, but I just think others, they've shown more as of late.
Yeah, others are just a little more proven in here. Most of his best work has been against Calbreds, and while he's a 3-time winner on the turf, he's actually faster on Beyer speed figures on the dirt. So he does need a career best effort in here, second start off the bench.
And next up in the field's Freeport Joe. We showed up his runner-up finish, I should say, when we showed Lamas winning pretty nicely against that group. And the big question for him is, it's been a while since he's been on the turf. And I think the other thing is these other horses that he's faced locally at Golden Gate typically have gotten the better of him. He just hasn't been able to go to the winner's circle in quite some time. You have to go back to early 2023 to find it. With that said, I can't see it against this group.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Probably don't have to spend a whole lot of time on him. He's better on synthetic, and those local foes have gotten the better of him, as you pointed out. So he will need a career best in here, no doubt.
Now, a horse that's pretty much can run on anything at this point is Clovis Connection, as we've seen, as a winner on dirt, on synthetic, and in turf. And last time out off the layoff was third behind Johnny Padres and Lovesick Blues, was the pace setter in there and backed up. And I do think in this race, that's at 6.5. It's going to stretch out to a mile. Figures to probably be somewhat forward against this group.
Yeah, the key is with I think early on with him and Air Force Red, because I'm thinking those are the two fastest that will probably both want to be more forwardly placed in here. You dive into Clovis Connections races, and while he has got the mile trip, it was under pretty ideal circumstances in a race where he was heavily favored that day. He got the lead. He was kind of cruising. I just don't know if this is really his best trip in a race where he'll have to deal with other pressure. I can understand why they take a shot here. Blaine Wright is a fantastic conditioner, and they have a good sense of where these horses fit. So to see him run well in here would not shock me. I do just think he's a little bit up against it. And I have to see him prove it going longer against this kind of a group to know that that's a trip he really does want.
Yeah, he's a fun horse, though. 7 for 11 in his career with wins, well, all over the place if you look in terms of the West Coast. Up next in the field is Sumter. This one out of the Richard Mandela barn. Now, we showed the American. He ends up kind of running, I thought, even, but still held his own. We saw him. He finished third. Prior to that, you can see he's been knocking at kind of getting a bigger chunk, just hasn't been able to do so in those last 4.
Yeah, the key to him in this race, I think he's really going to trip out here, Ashley. He's shown us in his last few starts that he can pass horses and come from off the pace. And I think that's just maturity. We see horses sometimes as they get older, they start to develop more. They become just a different type of horse to where they're not so keyed up and they're not so one-dimensional where they just need the lead. In looking through his form, that sort of seems how he is. And honestly, if they go very fast in races where Air Force Red gets the lead and they're all strung out, he's shown that he can fall into a really nice spot and maybe get the jump on some of those deep closers in here. So if Air Force Red does run off in here, this is one who I think can sit a very similar trip to what he did in the American, where he's maybe 5 to 7 lengths behind, but still in front of Balnikoff and some of those deeper runners, and he could just put himself in a really good spot. It does start to concern me, though, when you get to a horse like this and you got to go back a long way. I think he's 0 for the last 13 as far as getting into the winner's circle. So while I can build a really nice case for him, and I think he gets a great trip, at some point you start to ask yourself if they do have that killer winstinct a lot of the time, or maybe they're fine just settling for minor awards.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I mentioned his last 4. He's been close. 5 starts ago, he was second, but as you've mentioned, the winner's circle was a very long time ago, and I don't know if necessarily he's versatile or they've just tried different things with him as well. Obviously, the blinkers have come off, and in his last 3, he's tried to close from off of it, and he's ran well, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily by design, because for a good portion of his career, he didn't race with blinkers, and he's forward. So we'll have to see what he does here at Golden Gate. He's never been over the turf course. We have one more here rounding out the main body of the field. It's the number 12, I'm a Gambler. This one on the Mark Glatt barn. They got this one back on the dirt last time. It seemed like it was just maybe an experiment of sorts, and the experiment didn't pan out well. It was his first time on the dirt. He only beat one other runner in there. But I do think, obviously, when they first brought him over as turf races, they hinted at some ability.
Yeah, I really liked him when he was cutting back from the mile races and he went down the hill at Santa Anita, and I thought that was going to be a perfect spot for him. And I've kind of followed him a few races since, and there have been a couple times where he was in really good spots and he looked like a real live horse in those races, and he just hasn't fired. It just hasn't been able to take the next step from some of his better races, in mid to late 2023. So I really have to see more from him. I kind of agree with you. It feels like they're kind of throwing darts right now. They went to the dirt. That didn't work. Let's come back. Let's try something. Now we're going to go long, and he's going to probably get a really wide, tough trip. He's actually never even won at a mile. It looks like it. He's actually won at 7.5. So a mile even might be a little farther than he really wants. Kind of cold on him with the outside draw.
So that's the last runner in the main body, the 13. The also eligible is Prince Abu Dhabi, but just very quickly, he's actually cross-entered in a race the same day out at Santa Anita, race number 4 on their card. He's a horse that is 6 for 8, a consistent type, but getting tested for class. So that is the field. A great rendition, though, of the Grade 3 San Francisco Mile. And I think we're going to be on similar pages here. I think
Yep.
there's a couple of horses that, when we handicap this, you don't have the morning line, which I think is another sort of debate, right? What sort of odds are you going to take on these specific horses? But you can see Gino, super effective box, looking
Yeah.
exactly the same for us. You went with the 6, Air Force Red, who looks to be maybe the pace setter in here.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping. Third off the bench, should be ready to take one more step forward off of those speed figures, and that would put him right back in the mix. As I pointed out, I think if they all were to line up and give their best effort, that Air Force Red probably has the best race in here to throw. So I put him on top. Underneath, I went with Sumter, who we were talking about. I think he could just really fall into a nice spot. And you were hitting on it. I don't know if it's versatility or maybe he just wasn't as fast as some of the horses in those recent races, but he sure did get good setups. And I think he could again in here. We both think the two could get a really nice trip in here. And at the back end, it looks like we're both using the deep closer who has class and likes this track and likes this trip.
And you pretty much look at these horses. You have 3 horses coming in from Southern California. You have 1 main local horse. I went with the local horse because I think 2 things. I'm wondering if the buyer speed figure is going to catch people's eyes and they're going to maybe put some money on him at the windows. But at the same time, because there's all these shippers, I think he might not be really looked at in here. He might be an underdog, I thought, in terms of trip. He should be close enough to it early on that he only has to maybe pass 4 or 5 horses in those final stages. And I just think he's a better horse. You even said it. He might be a better horse now than he was a year or 2 ago. So 2, 4, 6, 11 for me, 6, 11, 2, 4 for Gino. We're not very creative in here, but it looks like to be a great field for the San Francisco Mile. Best of luck.